Hello, I'm Paul Mitchell, and I'm going to talk about how ecocriticism can be used to interpret the novel Roadside Picnic, which was published by the Strugatsky brothers in 1972. Okay, so when I refer to ecocriticism, I'm drawing on Camilla Gomides' definition that it analyzes and promotes works of art which raise moral questions about human interactions with nature, whilst also motivating audiences to live within a limit that will be binding over generations. And this last part is important, I think, for the way in which it asserts an ethical commitment on the part of authors and their readers. So I'm going to argue that this environmental ethic is accomplished in Roadside Picnic by the novel's negative envisioning of scientific industrial progress during the 20th century, and its implicit message about the need for a better interconnection between human beings and the natural world. So Roadside Picnic is a short novel by brothers Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, who are two of Russia's most celebrated science fiction authors, and it's probably their best known work in the English-speaking world. A brief overview of the story for those who haven't read it. The narrative focuses on the fictional town of Harmont and the aftermath of a visit to Earth by a highly advanced alien civilization. As a result of this visit, an area of the town called the Zone has now become sealed off behind a high wall and is under military control. And that's because the zone contains a number of advanced technological objects that the aliens left behind. For that reason, an underground community of stalkers or thieves has developed who try to enter the zone and steal these very valuable artifacts. The novel is narrated by two characters, Red Shoeheart, who's a stalker, and Richard Noonan, who works for the secret police and is responsible for trying to prevent the stalkers from selling their contraband on the black market. And so Roadside Picnic describes Red's various illicit visits into and out of the zone and the artifacts that he tries to sell to several clandestine or criminal organizations. So when reading Roadside Picnic from an eco-critical perspective, I think we can begin with the novel's location. Harmont is a town somewhere in the West, although most critics claim that this is actually Canada or the United States. But I think that insisting on such a specific place for the narrative perhaps rather misses the point. In fact, the geographical location of Harmont is never revealed, and we later discover that the aliens actually visited 5 other unknown sites across the globe. So this geographical indeterminacy supports Ursula Heiss's observation that what is important for ecological awareness and environmental ethics is not so much a sense of place as a sense of planet. The novel therefore promotes environmental thinking on the macro scale as a global concern rather than a specifically Western problem. And although it's possibly unintentional on the part of the authors, it's notable that the name Harmont draws attention to the trope of harm, which I believe has a particular eco-critical dimension in the novel. The story of Roadside Picnic takes place 13 years after the aliens' visit, and we're told that at that time, almost everyone who lived in the area of the zone got the plague. A few died, and people went blind. Strangely, they say, they weren't blinded by a flash of light, but by an awful noise. So the peculiar nature of this collective blinding indicates a disruption of the natural order as we know it. And as a result, I think we can profitably interpret the zone in relation to Maria Tumarkin's concept of a traumascape, that is, a site that has been transformed physically and psychically by suffering. For Tumarkin, one of the characteristics of a traumascape is the way that in places marked by violence, suffering, and loss, the past is never quite over. And Roadside Picnic explores this idea in terms of how the landscape physically bears the scars of trauma, but also continues to affect those who live there. 13 years after the visit, the zone is still a physical threat to human life because it's like living on the top of a volcano. An epidemic could break out at any moment, or something even worse. So, with this in mind, I think another useful way that we can think eco-critically about the disturbed and disturbing nature of the zone is through Roger Luckhurst's notion of weird topographies. In Luckhurst's words, zones are never easy spaces to occupy. They are often unnerving and transitional places where the usual laws are suspended. And we can see this in the zone in Roadside Picnic, where strange physical and meteorological phenomena take place. We read about the tremors or vibrations that seem to have a life of their own, as well as shadows that defy the laws of human science by stretching towards the sun rather than away from it. But even more disruptively weird are the strange after effects of the alien's visit on one of Red's closest relatives. Red's father, who died long before the story begins, is inexplicably resurrected from his grave and becomes one of the many living corpses that now inhabit Harmont. Smelling of damp, heavy earth, he's an abject manifestation of how the natural cycle of life and death has become ruptured. And so the presence of this monstrous offspring of the zone, as Richard Noonan calls him, is decidedly apocalyptic, a symbol of how the eco-critical site of the zone has been physically transformed and made harmful by the actions of an unknown alien civilization. In fact, the aliens never appear in the novel, but their non-presence is a grim harbinger of the ecological problems that can result from scientific progress. In the zone, the stalkers find technological miracles like space cells, which are batteries that can never run out, or bizarre objects like full empties that nobody can explain, as well as highly destructive ones like death lamps that kill several stalkers. But all these objects have been carelessly abandoned without consideration of the impact that they might have on the place where they land or on the people who find them. Highly advanced in technological terms, the alien civilization seems less commendable in terms of its ecological duty of care towards the planet on which it landed. And this idea is conveyed by the crucial metaphor of the novel's title. Whilst explaining the aliens' legacy on Earth, one of the characters suggests that their behavior is akin to that of a rowdy group of young people at a roadside picnic. The aliens' disregard for the effect that their actions have is clearly paralleled here with that of human beings, who throughout the course of the 20th century have had an increasingly negative impact on the natural world. As such, the aliens appear to be less an inscrutable other than a grim prediction about what humanity is becoming in our search for technological mastery. So rather than being a novel about alien malevolence, Roadside Picnic uses the sci-fi genre to contemplate human alienation. That is, how in our rush for scientific industrial progress, we've become estranged from the natural world and as a result, from ourselves. And there's no doubt that by locating Harmont somewhere in the West, the Strugatskys are critical of the environmental cost of capitalism. In the words of Marco Almiero, capitalism reproduces itself through the contamination of people and places. And this idea is illustrated in Roadside Picnic when Red steals a canister of a highly toxic alien substance called hell slime, which he then sells for personal profit to a clandestine military organization that wants to manufacture chemical weapons of mass destruction. When the slime is processed in a secret laboratory, it causes death and devastation. Living in Russia during the epoch of the Soviet Union, the Strugatsky brothers were raised as communists with a small c. And it's useful to remember that there's an important strand of Marxist thought that's focused on the environment. In the Paris manuscripts, for example, Marx writes that man lives on nature, which means that nature is his body, with which he must remain in continuous interchange if he is not to die. And then Marx goes on to emphasize that in estranging himself from nature, he estranges the species from man. So environmental negligence is identified by Marx as a form of othering, an act that alienates human beings from themselves. In part, Roadside Picnic points to the environmental damage that is intrinsic to the capitalist project. And yet, I think it would be misguided to believe that the novel is simply a diatribe against the West. Roadside Picnic was written in 1971 during the period of the Cold War. And so one of the novel's most important eco-critical anxieties is about how advanced military technologies in both the West and the East could be used to destroy the planet. In this sense, hell slime is symbolically equivalent to the development of nuclear weaponry. By the time the Strugatsky brothers wrote Roadside Picnic, they'd become disillusioned with the Soviet regime, a political experiment that had failed to provide the glorious future predicted by Marxism. The importance of scientific progress in the Soviet Union cannot be overstated. It was seen as the means by which Russia could be transformed from a poor agricultural country into an industrial and military superpower. And for that reason, the Soviet regime invested countless millions into what became known as the scientific technological revolution. Whole cities were built with the sole purpose of conducting scientific research. And here's a picture of one of them that's hidden away in the forests of Siberia. Roadside Picnic indirectly references this project when it mentions that one character lives in the science district. But rather than creating a more ecological way of living, the Strugatsky's novel explores the symbolic devastation that the scientific technological revolution has created. And it seems likely that the Strugatskys were partly influenced by a systems failure at the Mayak nuclear power plant in southern Russia in 1957. At that time, it was the worst man-made environmental disaster the world had ever seen. As it later became clear, high-level liquid nuclear waste had been released into the local environment for many years before the actual accident. And in 1968, the Soviet authorities finally banned all public access to the area around Mayak. So to use the Strugatsky's term, they effectively made Mayak into an alien zone, a weird location where medical abnormalities continue to be rife. In 2002, a study by Albrecht Kellerer of workers from the Mayak nuclear plant demonstrated that apart from those who were already dead, the survivors were still severely affected by radiation poisoning. Roadside Picnic explores the idea of toxic contamination through the character of Red's daughter, who he affectionately calls the monkey. During the novel, she degenerates from being a regular child into an abhuman state where she can no longer speak and grows fur across her body. Monkey's genetic mutation symbolizes the harmful corporeal effects that environmental pollution can have across generations. And as such, it can be understood in terms of transcorporeality, the concept that Stacy Alaimo uses to describe a mode of existence where people and places are substantially interconnected. And Alaimo's description of the ethical possibilities that emerge from the literal contact zone between human corporeality and more than human nature obviously has a particular relevance in the context of Roadside Picnic, given the prominence of the zone in Harmont, around which its eco-critical themes cohere. For Alaimo, an acknowledgement of this imbrication between humanity and nature is essential to posit an affirmative environmental ethics. By way of conclusion, I'd like to suggest that if, as Timothy Morton argues, there are layers of attunement to ecological reality that are necessarily weird, then Red's journeys through the weird traumascape of the zone are instrumental to the novel's subtext about environmental damage. An eco-critical reading of Roadside Picnic draws attention to the Strugatsky's concerns about how the Soviet Union was causing immense damage to the natural world, how in their race to become a superpower, the Soviet leaders neglected the ecological ideas of Marxist philosophy. And in this sense, they were no better than their counterparts in the capitalist West. But by way of contrast, the novel implicitly demonstrates that we need a more affirmative environmental ethics, a transcorporeal approach that protects both human beings and the planet on which we live. As one of the characters in Roadside Picnic suggests, intelligence is the ability to harness the powers of the surrounding world without destroying that world. So thank you for listening, and here are the references that I used for my talk.